So our next speaker is Chetana Mirle, who will be speaking about global farm animal protection efforts. Chetana is the program officer for animal welfare at Spring Point Partners LLC, which is a social impact venture committed to accelerating progress in animal welfare, sustainable water, learning innovations, and youth development through grant making, impact investing, and program operations. Chetana previously was a vice president at Humane Society International, where she built and led a global farm animal protection campaign largely focused on developing and emerging markets. She holds a PhD from Tufts University, where her dissertation explored the link between donor-funded agricultural programs and household-level food consumption in South Asia. Please join me in welcoming Chetana Mirle.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm very grateful to the Animal Grantmakers for inviting me to speak today. So when Andrew Rowan first invited me to speak, he said, Chetana, I had just changed jobs 8 months ago. He said, please reprise your old role. So I'm reprising my old role. So to give you some background on that, in 2007, I joined the team at Humane Society International to build a global campaign against industrial farm animal production. It's really focused outside of the US, and we focused specifically on developing and emerging markets, because that's where the greatest amount of growth in farm animal populations was taking place. And that's also where you saw the greatest amount of growth in industrial farming or in factory farming. And so it was, you didn't at that time have a lot of groups on the ground or a lot of local capacity, even within the animal protection movement, looking at farm animals. There were groups at the time looking at companion animals, but really the farm animal efforts were focused in Western Europe, in the United States, and more developed economies. So there was a great need to build that up at that time. So that's where we started. We started with a little campaign against battery cages in India, which sounds little, but it was actually, India is actually the third largest producer of eggs globally. And almost all of those hens are confined in battery cages. So they spend their entire lives basically immobilized without the ability to move. So we started in India, and by the time I left HSI about 8 months ago, last March, HSI was on the ground throughout Latin America, throughout Asia, in Eastern Europe increasingly, a little bit in South Africa, and also working with large multilateral institutions such as the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the World Organization for Animal Health, and also private kind of international institutions such as Rabobank, which is the largest financer of animal agriculture globally, to kind of impact the conditions for animals in places where we couldn't actually be on the ground running campaigns, so to truly have a global impact. And that's where, so most of my presentation today is going to be based on that experience at HSI. Just wanted, if you'll indulge me a little bit, I also just wanted to tell you where I am now and how that relates, because some of this links back to the work at HSI. So as Chris mentioned, I'm now at Spring Point Partners, which is a social impact venture that's committed to accelerating progress in a number of areas, including animal welfare and sustainable water. And we use a mix of tools. We're not a traditional foundation. We're an LLC, so we can do kind of an interesting mix of things, including grant making, impact investing, and we also do some direct programmatic work. Our animal welfare program is actually at the moment really focused on ending the inhumane breeding of dogs. So what some of you might know as puppy mills. So kind of the industry that pushes out all of those cute little puppies you can buy on the internet or in your pet store, but you know, the treatment of the mother dogs that actually produce those puppies. But while that's where our focus is, our animal welfare program, which is called Life of Riley, actually has a larger mandate to create a more humane world for all animals and to reduce animal cruelty across the board, including for farm animals. But our farm animal program technically is actually housed within our environment program, which is focused on water, as you can see. And this is because of the tremendous impact that animal agriculture has on both water quantity, water scarcity issues, and water quality issues around the world. So just to give you some graphs, if you can just see that animals are a really inefficient way to get your nutrition. So if you just look at the amount of water it takes to produce a calorie, calories from plant-based foods like cereals or pulses or veggies, as opposed to animal source foods, I mean, there's just no comparison. This is a really inefficient way to produce food. And beef is kind of this crazy outlier here, so, don't think that the other ones are that much better. So if you take beef out, you can still see that the other forms of animal source foods are still very highly inefficient relative to plant-based foods, just from a water perspective. So of course, this is in terms of calories, and who really cares about calories? We have this national obsession with protein. There's like protein shakes and protein bars on every shelf. It's like kwashiorkor is on the horizon. So let's look at it in terms of protein. But even if you look at liters of water versus grams of protein, you see that plant-based foods, so you look at a concentrated source of plant-based protein like pulses, and it's much more efficient than getting the same amount of protein from an animal. And I had taken beef out of this just because, it's such an outlier, but again, you can see that beef is probably the least efficient. And that was more of a water quantity issue, a water usage issue. But in terms of water quality, we know that the farm animal sector is one of the largest contributors to all types of water pollution at all scales, from global to local. So this is really where, at Spring Point, our animal welfare program and our environment program kind of merge together, is through our impact investing. So we are doing a lot of investment we're starting to do a lot more investment in plant-based meats and cultured and, kind of the clean meats. So products that look like meat, taste like meat, smell like meat, have the same texture as meat and dairy, but aren't. They come from plants or they're produced in a laboratory, sorry. Little concert, little musical accompaniment to the presentation. So this is where we're really focused in terms of our investment. And so I'm going to get back to the international portion, which this is also international as well. But I think what I've really loved about working in this space, which I'm pretty new to, is that it really covers, there's an institution that's covering every kind of piece of this landscape of clean and cultured meats and plant-based meats. There's people who are looking at finding new entrepreneurs and kind of bringing them to the forefront. There are food incubators that are really kind of helping these businesses be successful. There's entities out there that are connecting them to manufacturing facilities. Then there are entities who are connecting them to investors. So there's this huge complex landscape. There's entities that are working on kind of, the federal, the legislation that might be to make it easier to bring these products to market. So it's a really complex landscape, but there's really an organization or an institution working at every single space in the landscape, and I think that's why we're seeing it be so effective. And so what I'll talk about and so I mention that here because I think we need a little bit more of this comprehensive approach in the farm animal welfare movement more broadly. So getting back, this is my little segue into going back into my life at HSI, I did want to note that the investment in the alternatives is not just happening in the US or in Western Europe. In fact, I think some of the most exciting investors are actually in other parts of the world. So the Japanese government, their investment arm is investing in clean meat. The Singaporean government's investment arm is investing in plant-based meats and in clean meat. And even on the private sector side, you're seeing a lot more Asian companies, for example, get into the game here. Corn, which was a staple for UK vegans, my husband is British, for time immemorial, a few years ago was bought by a Filipino company. Just in response to kind of a movement even within these regions towards more plant-based eatings. And certainly there's new products coming up within Asia, just entrepreneurship and new products coming up in other parts of the world as well to meet the needs of this movement. The nice thing that I've liked is, as we all know, it's not enough to bring these products to the market because the industry is going to push back and make it difficult for us to actually sell these products and make them marketable. A few years ago, when we started working in the European Union, we started seeing these members of parliament from agricultural regions, I think in Italy, who started really pushing back and saying, you can't call things like vegan prosciutto, because prosciutto, that has to come from a slaughtered pig. It can't come from a plant-based analog. And all of these ridiculous regulations, which you see now here, as John mentioned, in the US as well. And so I was really excited recently to see some colleagues in India really kind of getting ahead of that and engaging with the government from the get-go. So they're getting the government research institutes involved in the R&D, the research and development of plant-based meats, even clean meats eventually. So the government is part of the picture from the beginning. So it helps kind of prevent some of those problems in the future. Not that they won't happen, but it will help mitigate a little bit. In general, I am a really big fan of partnering with the government. So I'm going to tell a couple of stories here that might express why I'm interested, and also some of the complexities of working internationally probably will come to the forefront. So I'm going to start just with this story of Green Monday in South Africa and how it came to be. So Green Monday, as many of you know, was actually a movement that was started in Hong Kong by a group by the same name. It was by a Hong Kong-based group called Green Monday. And it's very similar to Meatless Monday. Meatless Monday doesn't translate well in all languages, and it wasn't working well. So they started this concept of Green Monday. And actually they were making money, like going to corporations and helping them institute Green Monday in their corporations and charging a lot of money for it. So it was really taking off in Hong Kong. And so one of the things that we did at HSI is we really tried to share information across the globe. So we would have these monthly webinars where activists from all over the world could get on a webinar and hear each other present about a program. So we had David from Green Monday on a webinar talking about how this concept had really taken off in Hong Kong. And I had a colleague from South Africa who was on the phone. And he's like texting me through this whole webinar, call me back, I want to do this in South Africa. And at the time, I was like, South Africa is not like a really top priority for us for a meat reduction campaign right now. But I called him back, and he talked about how they had actually, so he's in Cape Town, the Western province, the West, and just within Cape Town, not even the provincial government, just within the city government, they had tried to launch Meatless Monday many years ago. And it had not taken off. There'd been an incredible pushback from the industry. And also, it's complicated to push these meat reduction campaigns in countries where you have hunger and malnutrition coexisting with obesity. So there's two things going on at the same time. There's still tremendous poverty. But there's still, also growing levels of obesity and chronic disease. So it's just a more complicated landscape. And it's also never popular to go after farmers. It's not popular here, and it's not popular in Africa. So Meatless Monday had kind of fallen flat on its face. And he said, but you know what? I think Green Monday is something that could really take off because it doesn't target a certain industry. It doesn't tell you to eat less of anything. It's really not popular in emerging markets to tell people to eat less of anything. So it's not saying eat less of anything. It's just saying be green, eat healthy. And it's something that's very, very positive. And so sure enough, it did start to take off. We started with kind of like the wealthier institutions first, the higher end restaurants and universities. But people started to see what we were doing in South Africa with Green Monday, and people were like, this is really positive. Why aren't you bringing this to the community at large? Why don't you bring it into the townships? So we took Green Monday into the townships around Cape Town. This is one of our partners, Mama Kaba, who was promoting just plant-based eating in the townships. And people loved the program. It was cooking workshops. And, we were very careful. We didn't bring in, at these cooking workshops, at these demos, we didn't bring in like, soy milk or like products that are just not accessible to people who live in the townships. We looked at what foods are available in the townships and what foods are familiar to the communities that live there. So don't bring in like pasta dishes or things that people don't eat there. So what are the local dishes that are eaten? What's available locally? And let's make that healthier and plant-based and really delicious. So that's what we started doing. And then the Western Cape government saw what we were doing, and this whole partnership emerged. And so now the province, the entire province, is promoting through its wellness program Green Monday. And it's such a beautiful thing, and it's been a great way to change the narrative around plant-based eating in that region. And this is just kind of a moment to say that governments are interested in partnering with different institutions around plant-based eating and around animal welfare. And it might not initially be because they care about pigs and chickens, they probably don't. But animal agriculture is linked to so many other problems, to food safety problems, to deforestation, to water problems, to climate change, as John mentioned. So these are all major issues that governments are tackling, and we're offering them a solution, and they are interested in having a conversation about this and partnering in a positive way. This is a cute story from the little country of Bhutan, but just shows how these partnerships sometimes emerge. So this started with something that had nothing to do with animal agriculture. So Bhutan had this like crazy street dog problem, rabies, dogs biting people, like I don't know what was going on. But it's a Buddhist country, they didn't want to kill the dogs, and so they got in touch somehow with HSI, and HSI started this program to spay, neuter, vaccinate these dogs, and it was extremely successful. So the Bhutanese government totally falls in love with HSI, right? And so they're so happy. And then they said, what else can we do with you? It was such a successful program. And so I'm like, I don't know, farm animals? And we were working on a battery cage campaign in India at the time. And they don't actually have battery cages yet in Bhutan, right? But you know, the industry was growing, and it was a possibility. Usually it's, you know, it's not far away. And so we said, maybe you should just ban battery cages. And they're like, all right, done. So then they banned battery cages. It seriously happened that fast. Okay, so it's not going to happen that fast anywhere else in the world, so it's a bad example, but it actually did happen that fast in Bhutan. And then the next thing that came out of that, they were like, well, let's do more with you. And then, so then they started this program called Jungsum Monday. And Jungsum translates to, it's not meatless, it translates to something, it's a little bit more spiritual, like Conscious Monday. Which is, but it's the same thing, it's a plant-based Monday. So then, you know, so we went from street dogs to battery cages to eating less meat. And it was just something that evolved out of a really beautiful relationship. And I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and say that everything is going to move as fast as Bhutan did, right? Usually this process is a lot slower. And so, you know, speaking to grant makers, and now that I'm in that grant making world myself, so it doesn't happen this fast, but this process does happen. And I think that we have to have patience for it, and I think that we have to invest in it. Because in the long term, this is a really sustainable solution to a lot of our animal and environmental problems. So I think long-term investment is just a key thing to think about. I know a lot of people are thinking, because those of you who are familiar with the farm animal protection movement know that a lot of progress has been made, especially on animal welfare issues like the caging of laying hens and the caging of mother pigs in the industry. And a lot of that progress has been made by working with food companies, major food companies like McDonald's and Compass Group and, you know, General Mills, and having them adopt these commitments to eliminate some of the worst practices from their supply chains. And it's happened relatively quickly if you think about, I mean, if you think in like in a government time frame, this private sector time frame is super fast, right, in terms of how they're adopting these commitments. So you could ask the question, why don't we just invest all of our resources here? Because a lot of these companies are multinational companies, and so they can influence, you know, kind of the animal agriculture sector across the globe and really improve practices and reduce cruelty in that sector globally. And there is definitely some truth to that. I don't want to minimize that at all. There's definitely some truth there, but let's think a little bit about the markets that we're working in. So in many of these markets, particularly in Asia, what you're seeing is that while they're home to some of the largest farm animal populations in the world, most of the food that's sold is sold unpackaged, unlabeled, really messy, complicated supply chains that nobody understands. So there's no way, if you're in India and you want to buy a cage-free egg, This is the guy you're buying the eggs from. He has no idea. He's sitting in a market someplace, in an open market. He bought it from a middleman who bought it from a middleman who bought it from some farmer who may be cage-free, who may not be cage-free, but it all gets mixed in. So there's no way of knowing if your egg is a cage-free egg. And that's not just a problem for an individual consumer. When we've gone and met with food companies, that's a problem for the food companies as well. They don't necessarily know where they're getting their eggs from. So the market is a little bit different here. This is a picture from Vietnam, and this is where we've done a lot of work. And it's also, it's notable that in terms of the number of pigs, not the pork output, which is a little bit different, but in terms of the number of pigs, Vietnam has the 4th largest population of pigs in the world. But how is there like a big agribusiness company that you can go after in Vietnam? There are some, but really the way the industry is structured is there's like, the majority of the farmers have between like 10 to 50 sows. Even farmers with just 2 sows keep their mother pigs confined in gestation crates, so they're completely immobilized for their entire life, even if they only have 2 sows, because that's just what they've been taught. And they're just spread across the country. So how are you going to get at this problem? I don't know if some of you are more familiar with the puppy mill industry here in the US that I've been working on, but it's kind of like there's just farmers all over and they have dogs and you don't know where they are, you don't know how they're being treated or where they're coming from. You don't know how to get at that problem because it's not like one big company that you can target. That's what it is with farm animals in some of these markets. So the only way to start getting at this problem in a sustainable manner is to include governments in that conversation. So this is why we're so excited about these partnerships with governments. This is just another story I'm going to tell. And it is a story from Vietnam. And it kind of it just shows the many elements that you need to make something successful, and this is still a story in progress. So going back to those corporate commitments, as you know, many of those companies that you know here that are even US-based companies who've said, like Compass Group or Sodexo have said, globally, we're cage-free by 2025. And so our teams in Singapore or in China or wherever will go and meet with Compass Group Singapore, Compass Group Malaysia, and they'll be like, what? Cage-free? What are you talking about? And we'll be like, no, here's a press release, really. Here's a commitment from headquarters, really. So they're like, what? And then they'll call headquarters, and it will be a confusing conversation, and then they'll come back, and they'll say, yeah, but I don't think this really applies to Asia. And we'll be like, no, it's global. That includes Asia. That includes Latin America. And so it's this whole negotiation to get them to even take the commitment seriously. And let me tell you, headquarters in the US or France or London is not putting pressure on them to do this. So if you want pressure on them, that's going to come locally. So you have these local advocates being, no, actually you're going to have to do this. And then the next question is, okay, so there's this reluctant acceptance that we'll do it, but there's absolutely no supply. And they're right. There are small farmers doing, who have chickens in their backyard, but that's not, like a safe, reliable supply chain of supply of eggs for a restaurant. And so you really don't have any commercial scale supply of cage-free eggs in these countries, so you're starting from scratch, right? So, just an example, we do this HSI, I shouldn't say we anymore. HSI does this in countries all over the world. Well, they'll have these roundtables where they'll bring together food companies, even though they don't account for very much of the market. They'll bring together these companies who have commitments to go cage-free, usually multinational, some local companies. And just as a roundtable to say, okay, you guys all have a commitment, let's solve this problem together. Let's see who your suppliers are. You probably have some suppliers in common. Let's start working with those suppliers and start educating them. So we started there. And then we brought in, so we started kind of right around Ho Chi Minh City, which has most of the multinational chains in Vietnam. If they exist, they probably exist in Ho Chi Minh City. So we brought together some food companies. We also brought together local government officials. So from the provinces and the rural areas around Ho Chi Minh City, we brought in those ag officials. And they brought farmers with them to show them that, hey, there's a market. If you guys converge to cage-free, here's this high-end market that's waiting for you. And it was a beautiful round table with actually Marriott being one of the sudden heroes, standing up and telling the farmers, the first one of you who goes cage-free, we guarantee you a contract, and we're going to pay significantly more for these eggs. So the farmers are now interested because they know that they have a market. Still no clue how to make this happen, right? But the local agricultural officials are also there. So then we came up with this plan, and we said, okay, well, here's all of the types of cage-free housing, equipment, and systems that are available around the world. And it was really too expensive for the Vietnamese context. Not only was it expensive, there's a different climate in Vietnam, there's different disease concerns. So what's working in Europe just can't be taken and transferred to Vietnam. Like, you need a new cage-free system for Vietnam, and this could apply to any country. So then we brought in, we started this whole thing where we brought in equipment manufacturers from Europe. We brought in groups of scientists both from Asia and from Europe to start designing systems that were relevant for Vietnam. And then we also started taking farmers, kind of our first adopters, to Europe, in particular, to train on cage-free facilities there, because it's not just a matter of pulling the hens out of cages and saying, okay, be cage-free. It's a whole different management system. So we started training them on the management system. Then we started finding financing for them in terms of, okay, well, now you have to convert. This costs money. Where do you find the money? Who's giving you a loan to adopt these new systems? So there's all of this stuff going on. And if you guys are starting to fall asleep, it's because it's really boring. And so none of this, maybe one piece of this is worthy of a press release, right? It's so boring. But the fact is that all of it has to get done. And so, again, kind of my perspective now, and I'm glad I have this experience of doing, work that is really important but really boring, and I bring that experience to the grant-making world, because now I know you've got to fund boring stuff. It's not all sexy, and none of this is worthy of a press release. But it all has got to get done if we're serious about improving the conditions of animals in our agricultural system globally. So kind of before I get to that, I just want to make a comment about the animal welfare work in general, because I think, it can just feel, there's a part of me, and I think there's a part of a lot of people who just don't want to do this piece. It's like, let's just do the meat reduction work. It's hard, it's really messy to do this work, and it's not particularly exciting. At the end of the day, these chickens get slaughtered. Even the cage-free facilities, as much as, I think another positive thing about us being on the ground and kind of directing this process of going to cage-free as opposed to just saying, yeah, be cage-free, is that we can get cage-free facilities that we like, as opposed to what the industry will produce, which is like, okay, it's cage-free, but you still don't have enough room to spread your wings. I mean, we can do a better job of cage-free if we're involved. Right now, even certified cage-free facilities that I've been to and that we've trained on, you go there and it's like, this is not a life worth living. And I don't, it's a really hard thing. Like, you get there and it's kind of like, worked so hard for this, and I'm not sure that this is really what I wanted. And it's much more exciting to do the meat reduction work. But the fact of the matter is that I think there's at least 80 billion land animals, and that doesn't include the aquatic animals we talked about throughout the rest of the conference, just the land animals. There's at least 80 billion and growing globally. And most of those animals, regardless of where they are in the world, whether they're in the US or whether they're in Europe or Asia, Latin America, and increasingly in Africa, are on factory farms. They don't have a life that's worth living. And a lot of them are confined, so they spend their life virtually immobilized. So someone has to do something about that. And so I think it is still worth investing in, even though it's not great work. And I will say also, the other pitch for doing the animal welfare work is that it does drive the demand for alternatives to plant-based analogs. So cage-free eggs are really, really expensive. There is no lying about that. We tried lying to the industry early on, saying, don't worry about it. It's just not even going to notice the increase in cost, right? But there is an increase in cost. It costs more to produce eggs in a cage-free system, and they will notice the cost. I don't care if it costs more, but it does cost more. It does impact their bottom line, and they're also really hard to get. So like cage-free liquid eggs are really, really hard to get globally. So for a company that's made a commitment and is just struggling to get enough cage-free eggs at a reasonable cost, that's driving them to plant-based alternatives. So this movement also really supports, the movement towards plant-based alternatives to eggs and meat. So it's my other plug for kind of doing this work. One, it's just a lot of animals. We have to do it. And two, it ultimately gets us towards another goal as well. So I will stop soon because I'm probably running out of time. But I just wanted, I kind of made this chart of all of the places that we have to intervene as advocates, as donors, all of the things that we have to fund. And I intentionally made them all the same size or I tried to, because they're all equally important, all of these different pieces of it. So we can't just focus on, one piece. We have to do every single piece of this, otherwise it's not going to be done properly. In terms of who are the stakeholders here, my favorite thing in my new job at Spring Point is to find interesting new entities to fund. And I don't know if everyone has that freedom as a grant maker. Because we're not a foundation, we're an LLC, we can just fund whoever we want, really. So it doesn't have to be a nonprofit. We can fund a lot of different entities. So just find really interesting players to fund. Like, you don't just have to fund a nonprofit. In fact, I think my new kind of thing that I'm tickled by this idea, and I talk to some people that I work with in financial institutions, and they're interested too, is they would be really interested in partnering with like a large donor or a group of large donors within the animal protection world and like doing some joint projects together. So for example, you see the World Bank financing. It's great. We're like fighting battery cages and they're financing battery cages facilities on the ground in Vietnam. It's great. But they might be interested in partnering with groups of donors or with a large donor to do an animal welfare project. And somehow that door is probably more open for dialogue between a donor and an institutional like the World Bank than it might be with an animal welfare group. I don't know. It's worth trying. But look for interesting, interesting entities to finance and fund and partner with, which could include equipment manufacturers or chefs. I don't know. And as I mentioned, I was feeling that when I was at HSI, and then I came into this world of impact investing through Spring Point, and I'm like, we know how to do this. We're already doing this in like the plant-based innovation world, right? We're funding we're funding and providing support in a lot of different places. It doesn't really matter, I think, and again, funding can happen at any of these levels. Funding can go to local groups, it can go to national groups, or even to regional or global groups. Funding is worthwhile in all of these places and is needed in every single one of these places and should be spread out amongst all those different levels. So I got this off of the internet. I don't actually know what it is. I just kind of liked it. And I think the point that I wanted to make, I think I liked the words. Some of the most interesting ideas and innovative ideas come from like really quirky people in strange places. And so I think as the donor community, and I think it's easier for an entity like Spring Point that has like paid staff that can really kind of hunt these people down and get to know the neighborhoods as such. But there's these mainstream voices in the middle, and they're great, and they're brilliant, and they're loud and charismatic, and they're telling you things. But that might not be the whole story. You might have to find those weird people in strange places to find those really innovative ideas, or at least to find all of the innovative ideas. There might be, in those mainstream groups with those charismatic leaders, you might find a lot of innovation there. You will. But if you stay in that space, you're not going to see all of the innovation. You're going to have to kind of travel out to the edges and see who else is there, seek out the quieter voices, seek out the odder-looking people, and to really find all of the really innovative ideas and the great kind of thoughts that we really need to carry our movement forward. So that's all. Thank you.
So I'm going to bring up John and Will, and you maybe ask questions of both together. Okay, here, hold on. And please wait for the mic too, because we're recording.
So this has opened my eyes to a lot of things I had no idea about, but it was primarily focused on human consumption of food. So have you looked into pet food manufacturers? Because it seems as if those folks are focused on animal welfare from certainly a marketing, and it sounds odd that it's coming from me. But what are we doing about that in terms of responsible food sources?
I just had one comment to make. So for example, I was speaking to someone from WellPet, which is a pet food manufacturing company, and they were telling me about conversations that they're having at the Pet Food Sustainability Council, which is an association, and they are talking about this issue. And they are, they're starting to get involved in that conversation about plant-based meats and like cultured meats. I mean, it's not something that they've incorporated yet, but it is a conversation they're starting to have, and it was fun because when we met with WellPet, we had just met with the Good Food Institute, so we're like, here, take all of these materials. So I think that conversation is entering that pet food space as well.
Any other questions? Anyone?
Warm them down.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, I wondered if what you think, or whether you think that big climate change philanthropic funders are adequately incorporating animal welfare issues in their philanthropy.
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think one of the problems with climate advocacy in general, and this is what I talk about in the first paper, is it's long been an environmental issue. They've owned it to a degree. I mean, there's horrific stories about climate marches where native groups interested in indigenous rights were told they'd be in the front of the parade, and then big environmental groups moved into the back. I mean, there's this real problem about climate advocacy in general being primarily white, wealthy, and environmental. And so I think climate advocacy has to be expanded generally to encompass a lot of movements, and that includes animals. And I actually think animal welfare and animal suffering can be a huge tool for climate advocacy, but right now they're not doing it directly. One of the interesting things I talk about in the first paper is there's plenty of indirect use, right? So a lot of times, you'll see climate advocates dressed up as polar bears. They probably own 10 times as many polar bear outfits as animal advocates. So you'll see them use animal imagery here and there, but there's a real problem of a lack of integration on climate advocacy and animals.
Anybody else? Well, all right. Well, oh, here we go.
It seems so straightforward to think that the intersection of environmental justice and big animal ag and the harm that it's doing to the globe. Why does it seem so obvious and yet so polarized?
Well, I think that I spent some time in the first paper trying to track that a little bit. Some of it has to do with the historic attempts to break up animal advocacy into environmentalism and animal welfare, which I think is a false dichotomy. And to get really esoteric, since we're at a law school, one of my research areas is looking back at the works of Muir and Carson and others and understanding that they believe that individual animals and population and environment were all part of a continuum of life that needed to be protected. So the actual doctrinal nature of these interests are the same, but academics rolled in the 80s, and what academics like to do is divide things up into boxes. So there's a lot of literature trying to divide up these interests. And with regard to the broader picture of why aren't we better integrated with other social justice issues, there's multiple problems there. One, just the way universities and NGOs organize themselves is we silo ourselves into areas. Most law students by their second or third year are now environmental law students, or workers' rights students, or animal students, when what we all need to be are justice advocates. And then I think the white, wealthy demographic problem in both environmental and animal protection is something that needs to get a lot of attention.
And with that, we are sticking the landing, ending right on time, as we like to do here. So, one more question from John.
I have to say to both of you that those were marvelously good presentations, and thank you very much for taking the time to put them together. I'm overwhelmed by trying to create green Mondays and things, and how much progress you can make with plant-based stuff if you don't advocate it so negatively. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Perfect. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers and Professor Scrub as well. So we'll take about 10 minutes, and if all the Grantmakers folks who are going on the tour can, we'll convene right outside in the door here, and then we'll walk on down to the new building. Thank you so much.